The golden image of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel 3, 1-30. In response to the revelation in Daniel 2 that Nebuchadnezzar would be the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar ordered the building of an image entirely of gold. No doubt this served to reflect his thinking that he did not want anyone to succeed him. Strictly speaking, Daniel 3 is not prophecy, as it does not anticipate a specific future, but the events of the chapter to some extent support the general idea of God restoring and saving his people. As recorded in Daniel 3, Nebuchadnezzar set up an image near Babylon that was plated with gold, 90 feet high. The image itself was probably built on a platform that raised its height. At the sound of the trumpet, everyone was commanded to bow down to the image. In the Babylonian religion, the power of the emperor was part of their worship of the Babylonian gods, and the two concepts were intertwined. While the whole multitude bowed down at the sound of the music, Daniel's three companions, whose Babylonian names were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, stood erect and did not bow down to the image. The king's followers noted this and reported it to Nebuchadnezzar. In a rage, Nebuchadnezzar brought the men before him, reminded them of the command, and told them if they did not bow down, they would be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, however, told the king that they could not do this because they served the true God. They told the king that their God was able to rescue them, but even if he did not, they would not bow down before the image. Nebuchadnezzar ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal and had the 3 men bound with rope and cast into the fire with their clothes on. As Nebuchadnezzar watched, he was astonished to see 4 men walking in the fire, unbound and unharmed. And he said that the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Verse 25. The 4th figure may have been Christ as the angel of Yahweh, or an angel. Approaching the furnace, Nebuchadnezzar asked the men to come out. Then he saw that the flames had not harmed them. Their hair was not singed, their robes were not scorched, and there was not even a smell of fire on them. Verse 26 and 27. Their marvelous deliverance prompted Nebuchadnezzar to issue a decree that anyone who would say anything against the God of Israel would be cut into pieces. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were promoted in their positions in the province of Babylon. Though the chapter is entirely history, to some extent, it anticipates the ultimate restoration of Israel in spite of the wrath of the Gentile world in the Great Tribulation at the time of the second coming of Christ. It was also an important chapter in the progress of Nebuchadnezzar in understanding the power and glory of the God of Israel. Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the great tree. Though Daniel 4 is largely a historical record of what happened to Nebuchadnezzar, it also contains a prophecy in its fulfillment as related to Nebuchadnezzar. The chapter is most unusual in that it is in the form of a decree of the king that was circulated throughout the empire. It is possible that Daniel had a part in framing the document on behalf of Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel 4, 1-3. The opening of Daniel 4 is a greeting recognizing the greatness of God, his marvelous signs and wonders, and that he is an eternal God. Daniel 4, 4-8. As in Daniel 2, Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and what he saw terrified him. As in chapter 2, he called in the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners, but they could not interpret the dream, even though he told them what he had seen. As a last resort, Nebuchadnezzar called in Daniel because of his previous experience in having him interpret the dream of Daniel 2 many years before. Daniel 4, 9-18. As recorded in Daniel 4, Nebuchadnezzar in his dream saw a great tree of enormous height and size that was visible to the whole earth. It bore beautiful fruit and lovely leaves. Beasts found shelter under it, and the birds of the air lived in its branches. Verse 9-12. As Nebuchadnezzar saw the tree, however, he heard, quote, a messenger, a holy one, end quote, coming from heaven and calling with a loud voice to cut down the tree and trim off its branches and scatter those that were being sheltered by it. Instruction was given, however, that the stump should be bound with iron and bronze. The messenger from heaven also said that Nebuchadnezzar should live among the animals and be given the mind of an animal and be drenched with the dew of heaven until, quote, 7 times pass by for him, end quote. Verse 16. Nebuchadnezzar reported that he was told that the fulfillment of this dream would make clear that God was the Most High God and able to set over kingdoms, quote, the lowliest of men, end quote. Verse 17. As he recited the dream to Daniel, he asked Daniel to interpret. Daniel 4, 19-23. Daniel was reluctant, however, to interpret the dream because he realized it was going to be a catastrophe for Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel summarized the image and then proceeded to the interpretation. Daniel 4:24 through 27. Daniel informed the king that the vision meant that the king would lose his mind. He would be driven away from his palace, would live like a wild animal, eating grass, and would act like the cattle of the field. Verse 24 and 25. The length of the trial would be 7 times, meaning 7 years. The fact that the stump had a band around it, Daniel interpreted as revealing that ultimately he would be restored to his kingdom. On the basis of this prophecy, Daniel pleaded with the king, quote, "Therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that then your prosperity will continue." End quote. Verse 27. Daniel 4:28 through 32. As the vision had indicated, 12 months later, as Nebuchadnezzar was walking on the roof of his royal palace in Babylon, he said to himself, quote, "Is not this the great Babylon I have built as the royal residence, by my mighty power and for the glory of my majesty?" End quote. Verse 30. As Nebuchadnezzar said these words, he heard a voice from heaven indicating the time had come to fulfill the prophecy of the vision. Daniel 4:33. Nebuchadnezzar, according to the decree, was then driven away and ate grass like cattle. He lived outdoors with his body drenched with dew. His hair was allowed to grow, and his nails became like the claws of a bird. Verse 33. His rare illness has been identified as insomnia zoanthropica, or boanthropy, in which an individual thinks of himself as an ox. Daniel 4:34 and 35. At the end of the 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar's sanity was restored, and he expressed in the decree his praise of God, declaring that God's dominion was eternal, and that all people were under his authority, that he could do what he pleased, and no one could tell him to hold back his hand. Daniel 4:36 and 37. Subsequent to his restoration of sanity, he was immediately returned to his former glory as the king of the empire. It is probable that Daniel was instrumental in maintaining the kingdom during the 7 years of the king's insanity, and also assuring the king's court that when he came to the end of the period, he would be restored. Ordinarily, if something like this had happened, his enemies would have conspired and killed the king. Nebuchadnezzar closed his decree with this statement, quote, "Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right, and all his ways are just. And those who walk in pride, he is able to humble." End quote. Verse 37. This chapter makes clear that Gentile power is subject to the will of God and will eventually be destroyed. On the basis of this experience, the question has been raised whether Nebuchadnezzar ever placed faith in the God of Israel. Though opinions vary, he does seem to have had a growing consciousness that the God of Daniel was the true God, as illustrated in the revelation of the 4 kingdoms of the image in Daniel 2, his experience with the companions of Daniel in Daniel 3, and now this personal experience where God made it clear to Nebuchadnezzar that all his power and grandeur was subject to God's bestowal. It may be that in answer to Daniel's prayer over many years, Nebuchadnezzar put his faith in the God of Daniel. Belshazzar's feast and the fall of Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar died in 562 BC, his son Evil-Merodach succeeded him. He turned out to be a poor leader and was assassinated by Neriglissar after he had reigned 2 years. Neriglissar occupied the throne for 4 years when he died and was succeeded by his son Lavorosokod, who was only a child. He occupied the throne for only 9 months until he was beaten to death by a group of conspirators who made Nabonidus king. Nabonidus reigned from 556 BC to 539 BC when Babylon was conquered by the Medo-Persians. Belshazzar, who was named as king of Babylon in Daniel 5, was appointed by Nabonidus after he had reigned for 3 years, and Belshazzar assumed this position for Corgent in 553 BC and principally governed the city of Babylon because Nabonidus lived elsewhere. Liberal scholars had long attacked the historicity of Belshazzar because his name had not been discovered in any secular history. However, with the discovery of the Nabonidus cylinder, in which Belshazzar was mentioned, liberals no longer can attack the historicity of Belshazzar, even though they were shown in acknowledging their previous mistake. The beginning of Belshazzar's service as corregent with Nabonidus in 553 BC became important because it was in that year that Daniel had the first of his 4 visions in Daniel 7. Actually, Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 both occur in the time period between Daniel 4 and Daniel 5 and are out of chronological order, possibly because Daniel desired to give the final chapter of history on Babylon and the resulting incident of himself in the lion's den before turning to prophetic analysis of the 4 empires in chapter 7 with additional information in chapter 8. Perhaps more important was the fact that Daniel had received the revelation of chapter 7 and 8 before he came to Belshazzar's feast. The revelation of Daniel 7:8 reinforced the earlier information given in Daniel 2 when Daniel prophesied the downfall of Babylon. The message on the wall that Daniel was to interpret supported Daniel's opinion that this was the night of destiny when Babylon would fall. The situation King Belshazzar faced at the time of the banquet was that the Medes and the Persians had already conquered all the empire of Babylon except the city of Babylon itself. Babylon was built to withstand a siege of 20 years, and according to the account of Herodotus, it was a tremendous city 14 miles square. The outer walls of the city were 87 feet thick and 350 feet high, with 100 great bronze gates in the walls. There was also a system of inner and outer walls with a water moat between them, which made the city even more secure. The wall was so strong and broad that chariots could parade on top of it 4 abreast. Herodotus also pictured hundreds of towers that reach 100 feet in the air above the wall. Most contemporary scholars believe, however, that Herodotus greatly exaggerated the size of the city, and archaeology seems to confirm that it was much smaller than Herodotus claimed. Actually, it may have been about a third of the size of Herodotus' description. One of the important facts, however, was that the Euphrates River followed through the middle of the city in a general direction from north to south, the water going underneath the outside walls and the riverbank itself with walls on each side. Even with the reduced dimensions, Babylon was still the greatest city of the ancient world, with many tall buildings, some as high as the Temple of Bel, 8 stories high. The king's palace, which has been excavated, corresponds to what scripture records. The river was crossed both by a bridge and by a tunnel. In recent years, efforts have been made to restore some of the buildings, including the king's palace, for the sake of tourist trade. Thousands of visitors come to Babylon each year. Because more than 10,000 clay tablets have been found and inscriptions reciting various aspects of Babylon's history, a great deal is known about the city. Because of Babylon's great construction and wall system, Belshazzar and his fellow rulers in Babylon felt safe, even though the city had been surrounded for some time. There was cause for alarm, however. Nabonidus had already been captured, and the fact that the city was surrounded did not speak well for her future history. The banquet was designed to reassure the leaders and the people of Babylon of the superiority of their god Bel and the certainty of their victory over their enemies. Daniel 5, 1-4. The opening verses of Daniel 5 reveal that 1,000 Babylonian nobles had assembled for this great feast, probably meeting in the throne room itself, which archaeologists believe they have identified in contemporary Babylon. It was a typical orgy where many drank wine until they were drunk. Not only nobles, but also their wives and concubines drank with them. Because of this desire to attribute his future victory to their god Bel, Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver goblets taken from the temple in Jerusalem and use them to drink to their god. This was a special act of blasphemy against the true God. This was probably the first time that they had been so used. Scripture records, quote, "As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone." End quote. Verse 4. Daniel 5, 5-6. In the smoke-filled banquet room, lit only by torches and resounding with the noise of the banquet, something happened that almost immediately stilled conversations and the revelry. As Daniel recorded it, quote, "Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. his face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his knees knocked together and his legs gave way. End quote. This was obviously a message from God because although the hand was writing on the plastered wall, there was no arm or body connected to it. No doubt there swept over Belshazzar's mind some of the supernatural feats attributed to Daniel and his three companions as outlined in chapters 2 and 3, and also Nebuchadnezzar's experience as recorded in Daniel 4. Daniel 5, 7, and 8. Just as Nebuchadnezzar had done in chapter 2 and 4, so Belshazzar, quote, called out for enchanters, astrologers, and diviners, end quote, with the view of having them interpret the writing. He promised, quote, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom, end quote. As Nabonidus was the number one ruler and Belshazzar was number 2, he was offering the most he could by making the interpreter number 3 in the kingdom of Babylon. When the wise men came, however, they were unable to interpret the writing any more than they could the dreams in Daniel 2 or Daniel 4. This left Belshazzar all the more in a panic. His face grew paler, and his nobles did not know what to say. Daniel 5:8. Daniel 5:10 through 12. Daniel recorded that the king, hearing of the problem, came into the banquet hall. Scholars are uncertain as to whom this was. She could have been the surviving wife of Nebuchadnezzar. She could have been the wife of Nabonidus. She could have been the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, or she might have been the wife of Belshazzar. Whether or not she was a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. In effect, she said to Belshazzar, quote, pull yourself together. There is a solution to your problem. End quote. Daniel recorded, quote, the queen, hearing of the voice of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. O king, live forever, she said. Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, I say, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. This man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. End quote. Verse 10 through 12. The reference to Nebuchadnezzar, the father of Belshazzar, can be explained as he may have been his grandfather, in which case Belshazzar was his grandson, or possibly it could be used simply in a successor sense of one who succeeded Nebuchadnezzar. In any case, she addressed Belshazzar to remind him that there was one in the kingdom who could interpret the writing. The fact that the queen was allowed to enter and speak so freely was characteristic of the ancient world, which honored parents particularly. Exodus 20:12. 1 Kings 2:13 through 20, 2 Kings 24:12 through 15. Daniel 5:13 through 16. When Daniel was brought before the king informed him that he understood that Daniel was able to interpret dreams and therefore would be able to read the writing on the wall. Belshazzar promised, quote, if you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. End quote. The appearance of Daniel, a venerable man of possibly 80 years of age, was in contrast to the drunken nobles who, with their wives and concubines, occupied the banquet hall. It was as if God was there to challenge their wickedness. Daniel 5:17 through 21. Daniel disavowed any interest in the gifts or positions offered him and assured Belshazzar that he would read the writing. Daniel reminded Belshazzar, quote, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor, end quote, verse 18. Daniel pointed out how Nebuchadnezzar was an absolute ruler who would promote or demote as he wished. However, as Belshazzar already knew, Nebuchadnezzar had his period of insanity when he acted like one of the beasts, verse 19 through 21. Only when Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes, was his sanity restored. Verse 21. Daniel 5:22 and 23. Daniel then reminded Belshazzar that he knew all these things, but did not humble himself before the Most High God. Instead, Belshazzar had blasphemed God, as he had taken the goblets from the sacred temples of Israel and had used them in praise of his own gods, quote, of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, end quote, verse 23. Daniel reminded him that his gods would not hear or understand. But the important fact was that Belshazzar had honored his Babylonian gods instead of the true God. Daniel 5:24-28. Daniel then interpreted, quote, "This is the inscription that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin," end quote, verse 25. Only the consonants of these words appeared on the wall, making it even more difficult to discern what was meant. The word Mene meant numbered. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Verse 26. The repetition of the first word made it all the more certain. The word tekel meant weighed. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Verse 37. Peres, the singular of parson, meant divided. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Verse 28. The inscription meant that his kingdom had been numbered, weighed, and divided. Daniel 5:29-31. In keeping with his promise, Belshazzar put purple clothing around Daniel and a gold chain around his neck and proclaimed him the third highest ruler in the kingdom. All this, however, was empty because, as Daniel recorded, quote, that very night Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62, end quote, verse 30. The sudden end of the Babylonian Empire, which came on that fateful night, is typical of the end of Gentile power at the second coming of Christ. Though the city of Babylon was not destroyed in 539 BC when the Medo-Persian Empire took over political power, at the second coming of Christ, even Babylon the city will be suddenly destroyed. Revelation 18. This prophecy and its fulfillment provides further proof that literal fulfillment of prophecy is normal, as illustrated in hundreds of instances in the Old Testament. Daniel's prophecy of an empire that would follow Babylon was fulfilled by the Medes and Persians conquering Babylon.